with David Grant. I want to introduce myself. I'm Leslie Perovich. I'm the Director of Marketing and Development here. So if I got a chance to meet when you came in, great. If I didn't, please stop by and say hello before you leave. David, if you could come up for a minute. We want to take a moment and really express our appreciation to David. And we have something for David here, and I hope that I'll let David unveil it. There, hold it right in the back.
All right.
Proclamation from the city of Newport Beach. And for those of you who haven't been to every single one of David's lectures, David has been lecturing here for 15 years. And so this is a really great gift that he's given to the museum and really to the community as a whole. So, and I'm just going to read you a couple of the things on the certificate because I was certainly amazed at some of the things you've done. And so I'm going to share with our audience. So David has been here for 15 years. But he's also been president of the museum here. He's president emeritus of Orange Coast College. He's also been the dean of students, and he's been director of maritime programs and head crew coach. He's also the 6th West Coast mariner to be included into the Intercollegiate Sailing Hall of Fame in Annapolis. He's competed in several Trans-Pacific and Mexican yacht races. He's climbed to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. And he's been featured in the nation's premier sports magazine, Sports Illustrated. So David truly is a Renaissance man. So again, we want to thank you for coming, and more importantly, we want to thank David for his incredible gift to us over these 15 years. So again, thank you for coming, and enjoy the last in our Seafaring Tales of those lesser known but still important explorers. Thank you very much.
I have a short story to tell you, which vaguely relates to this evening. Anyway, good evening. This fellow is walking along the avenue and he sees a sign that says, "Talking dog for sale." Guy goes in and says, you really have a, sees this guy, you really have a talking dog? I said, yeah. He says, can I see him? He says, yeah, it's right back there. So the guy walks back and he looks at this dog, kind of nondescript, and he says, I don't know exactly what to say. Do you, so to speak? The dog says, sure, English. The guy says, really? He says, yeah. He says, how is this possible that a dog speaks? The dog says, I don't know, it's just an anomaly. When the CIA found out that I could speak, they used me. I worked for them for a time because, you know, people don't expect a dog to be able to listen and repeat things. And so I was into a lot of sort of spy stuff. And then I got outed, and so I moved to Switzerland, and I worked on a ski lift for a time, and I had the barrel, the brandy thing, and that was really fun. Then I came back to the States and got married, and that didn't work out, and then this guy adopted me, and so I, kind of been here ever since. And the guy says, well, this is incredible. I mean, it's not possible. So he looks at the guy who's selling the dog, and he said, why are you selling this dog? And the guy looked very disgusted, and he said, he's never done any of those things. But the people we're talking about this evening did do those things. And they are actually a pretty remarkable crowd. There's a lot of explorers that we could talk about, but we can't do them all this evening. So I've chosen 5. At least the one thing they have in common is the North and the South Pacific Oceans. So they're all explorers in that area. There are lots of others. Anson, Bougainville, Wallace, and of course we've talked about James Cook a good deal. So these five, you may probably know something about, but there maybe be some surprising things for you about each one of them, which I hope will intrigue you. Cabrillo, he's Portuguese, but sailing for Spain. Abel Tasman, a Dutchman who is in the employ of the Dutch East India Company. George Vancouver, who was a charterer and an explorer of the Pacific Northwest. Matthew Flinders, a name you might not be familiar with, who circumnavigated Australia. And then Richard Henry Dana, whom you have some familiarity with within point. So this evening, each one of these characters is a colorful person. And though we spend just maybe 10 or 12 minutes and a very abbreviated look at them, I hope that we will give each one of the five enough of their due to make it appropriate. I've taken them in roughly chronological order. Each one of them is brave, even heroic, really. So here goes. One, Rodriguez Cabrillo. We know Cabrillo because Cabrillo Beach and not too much else. Born just before 1500, 1499, he is, we think, Portuguese, almost certainly, but sailing for Spain. He's born just 7 years after Columbus sailed. Cabrillo, from what we know, sailed out to Havana as a very young man and actually joins up with Cortez in Mexico, which of course then was called New Spain. So he's involved, you may not know, in some gold mining adventures in Guatemala, and he becomes a very rich man. And because of his services to Cortez, which are sometimes not entirely honorable, he is given property rights, he's given an extra gold mine, he's given slaves. It's very profitable to be on Cortez's good side. So it's about this time, in the 1540s, early 1540s, that the Viceroy of New Spain, and that was the person who was in charge of the whole area, Cortez included, commissions and authorizes Cabrillo to continue on up the California coast, thinking that perhaps, if the coast curved to the left, maybe it would lead to China, those fabulous cities that Marco Polo talked about. So it's actually pretty forward thinking, because if you think about it, it does curve. You have to go a long way north and a long way south, but it does do that. And then the other thought is, if he doesn't do that, at least he can claim a lot of things for Spain, and possibly, just possibly, he could find that fabled Northwest Passage. Everybody's searching for this, because they're looking for that shortcut to the Pacific from Europe. Rather than going all the way around Cape Horn, or the simpler solution would be to go over the top, if there was in fact a way to do that. So it's fairly easy to romanticize these characters, to Hollywoodize them, and these early explorers. And I suspect he didn't look like that. The truth is, they went to sea in the most fragile, the most badly designed, the worst constructed, comfortless, bleak ships. And the voyages usually ended in tragedy. So it's easy to romanticize these things, but life is very, very fragile on these voyages. Of course, life at home wasn't that great either. So being at sea, it sounds pretty awful, but actually life, existence with all the plagues and one thing and another in Europe, being at sea isn't all that bad. So Cabrillo, with the encouragement of the Viceroy, with his own money, has a flagship built, a couple of 100 tons, and the Viceroy gives him a couple of smaller vessels, and he's going to go exploring up the California coast. Well, why is he doing this? Because he thinks the possibilities of treasure are immense, and it will be all his. So, in June of 1542, he has come from Europe, and now was in New Spain, in what we now know as Mexico, and then he heads north. So, ships are like this. They're just awful. They hobby horse like this. They go maybe max 2 knots. Sometimes 2 knots backwards. They're absolutely horrible ships, terrible designs, but that's the way things were. So he sails from the port of Navidad, and I think this is close to what we now know as Manzanillo. So he sails along the coast and sails up to, and by mid-September, he's actually anchored in Ensenada. And at the end of September, he is ashore in what he called San Miguel. Now, it's what we call San Diego Bay. Now, it didn't look exactly like this when he was there. But that's where he was. It was called San Miguel. Now he's really sailing in very uncharted waters. No Spanish ship had ever gone this far north. So he is the first documented European to be sailing up here. And one of the places he stopped was Catalina, which he called San Salvador. Most of the things that he names get renamed by other Spanish explorers as they go along. But for the moment, this is San Salvador, Santa Catalina. There were actually Indians there to meet him. They apparently got along all right. And he sails out to San Clemente, and he calls that Victoria, named after one of the smaller vessels. And he does move right along. He, the next day, probably a couple of days actually, getting back to it, he gets back to what he then called Bahia de las Fumas, Smoky Bay. And you can guess where that is, San Pedro. Because the chaparral had been burning for a few days, and so it was, and the Santa Ana apparently blowing the smoke out to sea, and so hence Smoky Bay. Now, they don't stay any place very long. And of course, they anchor mostly at night because, as you and I know, around here, usually there isn't any breeze at night at all. And also anchoring along our coast is actually fairly easy. So the next day, they move up to Santa Monica Bay, where they anchor for the night. Again, these ships are moving very slowly, so they, though we talk about them moving in fairly quick terms, it takes them days and days and days to go 20 miles. So then they go a little further north to San Miguel Island. Now, one of the problems with Cabrillo is there was never any log found. So what we rely upon are some stories that get handed down by crew members who did actually return. Here we think, it appears as if Cabrillo somehow broke his arm. Well, that would not be a good thing. I mean, not a big thing, but you know, if you break your arm, you don't have a surgeon or anything to help you solve this, and it does inhibit. If you're trying to wear armor, trying to put on armor with a broken arm might not be the most fun. But they sail north, and they sight a place which he called Cabo de Pinos, which is Point Reyes. But somehow they miss the entrance to San Francisco Bay. It's interesting. But you can see how that could happen. you can be a little bit offshore, and all those hills look alike, and so they completely miss San Francisco Bay. Now, they get up here, and you know, the coastline is not entirely hospitable. And then, now it's November, and it's, you know, November in San Francisco. It's cold, and it's wet, and it's actually fairly miserable. So they push south back to Monterey Bay. The crews are hungry, they're tired, and everybody is vaguely lost. These are not good charterers. He names things, but how to find them again is another problem. You can pick out a Point Reyes and call it whatever you want, but how do you find it again? Because one of the things that Cabrillo was not good at was charting, and that becomes an important aspect of other explorers we're going to talk about. So it's now November, it's now December, and on or about Christmas Eve, he goes ashore at San Miguel, and he thinks apparently that some of his crew members are being attacked by Indians, and so he stumbles ashore, and he stumbles in the rocks and breaks his shin, and it gets infected, and 6 days later, Juan Cabrillo is dead. And so it's a pretty tragic time. It's gangrene that has set in. And where he is buried is anybody's guess. Probably someplace in Alta California, Northern California. Spain likes to think he was returned to Spain, and that's probably not likely. So buried someplace in the north. But so he is suddenly gone. His second in command brings the remainder of the fleet back to where they began, near Manzanillo, 10 months before. But I think it's important to say that Cabrillo, sailing up the coast, was the first real guy to explore that. And how he named about 40 different places. A lot of these places get renamed by a fellow who comes along a little later, Viscano. But by the way, it's Viscano who changes the name from San Diego, from San Miguel back to San Diego. But he's still the first European to really explore along that coast. And from that standpoint, that alone makes him something of a hero in the first explorations of California. You remember the year, how difficult it was sailing in this area. Now, a totally different fellow, Abel Tasman, is born in the 1600s, mid-1600s in the Netherlands. He worked for the Dutch East India Company, which was a powerful company based in the Netherlands and in Batavia. Batavia, when we say Batavia, think Indonesia. So that's that area. He's best known for a couple of voyages. And not just the voyages, but where he was voyaging. Here is a guy in the 1600s who was going to do most of his sailing not in the comfort of up and down the European coast, but in the Southern Ocean, in the coldest latitudes possible, the roaring 40s and the screaming 50s. So at this time, Australia was not known as Australia. It was then called New Holland. And no one had ever, including, this was before Cook, no one had ever seen the east coast, the coast of Sydney that is on. Nobody had ever seen that. The only coast that they had ever seen was Western Australia, across the Indian Ocean. So Dutch ships trying to get to Batavia regularly banged into New Holland. And when I say banged in, I mean lost. They hit it, and the ships were destroyed, and most of them died there. And if they were lucky, they salvaged a few things, made a dinghy out of it or a wherry out of it, and somehow got around to Batavia. But most didn't. Most simply, I mean, in the middle of the night, you just crash into Western Australia, and there you are. with a bunch of Aborigines with spears. So he is ordered by the Dutch East India Company to go to Batavia, but more importantly, he was directed because of, once again, Marco Polo. You know, that guy led more people astray. He was directed because Marco Polo had written these words: "Go where gold was so plentiful that none who did not see it believed it." Yeah. Well, it was supposedly someplace south of the Solomon Islands. Someplace south of the Solomon Islands. Well, Marco Polo does get one thing right. He said, he spoke some truth when he said this gold-bearing province, it's very isolated because whither few go from other countries because of the inhumanity of the natives there, meaning the cannibals. So he does at least get that right, because they certainly were. So off goes Tasman, vaguely looking for this land that Marco Polo is talking about, someplace south of New Holland, which we know as Australia now. In a couple of vessels called yachts. Well, the word yachts in Dutch simply means this ugly, horrible little sailing ship. It doesn't mean yacht like we know yacht. It's just a Dutch term, so they have a couple of these yachts. And they go across with these two little ships. They go across from south to Cape Town, the bottom of Africa, then across the Indian Ocean, and they head east with hail and snow and terrible conditions, roaring 40s. The one thing that navigators knew at this point was latitude. This level of things. They don't know this way, but they know this way. So they could figure out where the bottom of New Holland was, and that was his goal. So he's to get down there someplace and find this land that Marco Polo is talking about. So Tasman goes way south, and where he goes, as you can see right down here, is so far south that now he's into icebergs and everything else. It's absolutely horrible. It gets colder and colder. And he doesn't have any idea of what he's seeing day or night. Eventually he comes to what we call Tasmania. And he calls it Van Diemen's Land. Now Tasman is nobody's fool. His boss's name is Van Diemen. So he names Tasmania Van Diemen's Land. And for a long time, it's known as Van Diemen's Land. So one of the things that you cross as you come into the bottom part of Tasmania is Storm Bay. And if you have done that, as I have several times, there's a reason it's named Storm Bay. It's absolutely horrible most of the time. Now, it's December. Oh, by the way, it's too rough he thinks as long as he's there, he might as well claim it for the Netherlands. So, but it's too rough to get ashore with a wherry or dinghy. And so the carpenter takes the Dutch flag, jumps over the side, swims to the shore, through the surf, plants the flag, swims back. And so technically, Van Diemen's Land belongs to the Dutch. It's December of 1642 when he does this. Can you imagine any of us the excitement of seeing a piece of land, an island or a coastline that no European has ever seen before? Not possible that anybody has ever seen this. You are the first one. You know, we have all walked along a beach when we were kids and wondered if these footprints had ever been repeated by anybody else, you know, and that's what they must have felt like. Well, Tasman then tries to head north and he has a hard time doing it. And so he is driven further and further out to sea, and then he comes on another piece of land, and this is brand new to him. It's the South Island of New Zealand, and he's the first guy to see New Zealand. And they are just along the, now this is, you have to have some imagination here. They are on the west coast of New Zealand. So he thinks that New Zealand's over here, way over here. He thinks that this, what he's found here in New Zealand, is somehow connected to here. And so he names it Stockton Island, because there's a little island near Cape Horn named Stockton Island. And so he names this place Stockton Island too. But he doesn't stick around, and he doesn't explore it. Because there doesn't seem to be too much use to it. And anyway, he really doesn't know where he is. One thing he does know, one of his boats goes ashore with 4 crew members, and they don't return. And this is New Zealand, and these are Maoris. And they eat enemies. And they did. And Tasman calls this place Murderer's Bay. New Zealanders now call it Golden Bay. It's a nice, nice change. But he sails along here. This is one of the drawings from that boat that went ashore. But he sails along here, but you can see he's just touched this. And he thinks this is connected to Cape Horn. So that's how, and of course, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. So they really don't have any understanding of this whole area. So he does finally get north. He gets up to Tonga and to Fiji, and he's through a bunch of very dangerous reefs. He nearly loses his vessel several times, and then he manages to return to Batavia. His handwriting, by the way, when I have his logs, and his handwriting is absolutely beautiful. It's this wonderful script that's very easy to read, in Dutch, unfortunately, but let me read you some of his prose. And it's not much different than you and I might write in our logbook. The 22nd of February, 1543, in the morning, the wind was still northerly with heavy rain. Our course was westerly, and we had very heavy swells from the northwest. The weather is dark, gloomy, foggy, drizzly, then strong winds, then calm. We estimate our position, and this is interesting, at 13 degrees south, 192 degrees east. 192 degrees east. Well, that's not something we would ever use today, because we stop at 180. But in those days, Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu decided that the line for starting would be 20 degrees west of Paris. And that would be the line, and you go 360 from there. So that's why that degree would be 192 instead of stopping at 180. So the 20 degrees west of Paris was thought to be the end of the old world, the end of the landmass of the old world, and that's why that came about. So to finish his log entry, the sea is still very rough, and we have had copious amounts of rain, and now a strong gale. We hove to with reduced sail, while the sea is very rough from all directions. When the sea gets angry down there, it does come from all directions, and it's not like here where you have a westerly swell or that you can depend upon. It just comes like a mixmaster, like a washing machine, and it's very, very difficult sailing. Well, Tasman has another voyage. and he has actually 3 ships this time, and all of them are now going to be north of New Holland, which is, of course, still Australia. He's right between Batavia and New Holland, in that stretch right there. And his job is to get out into the Pacific and turn right and go down the East Coast. Remember, this is something that Cook did quite a bit later, but nobody else had done yet. But he doesn't get it. He misses the Torres Strait. This is between New Guinea and the top of Australia, and he misses it. So that's the problem. He's someplace north. He goes up in here. Now he's completely lost. And all of this is a very, very big disappointment to the Dutch East India Company, because what are they looking for? Actually, they're not really looking to explore. They're looking for trade. And they haven't found anything but a bunch of primitive aborigines to trade with. And so they are not happy with him. So he finally makes it back. He does get into some beautiful territory, and he does get back to Batavia, but he is absolved of doing any more exploring for the Dutch East India Company. They want a new explorer, only they don't get one. They don't choose one. And they leave, really, New Holland, Australia, alone until James Cook arrives a century later. So it's interesting. But Tasman name, and you have to give him a lot of credit. Here we are, the 1600s. This guy sailing his horrible little ships in the roaring 40s, the screaming 50s. And he has a reputation, of course, Tasman for Tasmania now. Tasmanian devil. They're not as ferocious as they look. They're night creatures, really, and you have to coax them out to ever get them out of a cave or anything. They're mostly mouth, and mostly the sound is that's about all they do. They don't bite you or anything. So, and then Mount Tasman in New Zealand. The Tasman Glacier, if you've been to New Zealand, you've almost certainly seen that. And certainly the Tasman Sea, which is between Australia and New Zealand, probably with the most monstrous waves and roaring gales in the world. And all I'm saying is that in the 1640s, you had to be a pretty brave soul to be down there doing those things. You probably better have signed your will, too. So, a lot of these explorers invariably had their portraits painted with a globe. And it was almost all of them did. It's interesting. Now, our next guy is George Vancouver, an interesting guy, born in the mid-1700s, 1757. You may remember that he joined Captain Cook on HMS Resolution on Cook's second voyage, which, among other things, was to search for that all-mysterious continent, which everybody kept believing was down there, because there was so much landmass in the north, there had to be a landmass down south. They're not talking about Australia now, or Antarctica, something else. The belief was that some huge piece of land was someplace in this area, or this area. But of course, there's not. But they didn't know that then. So one of Cook's jobs was to see if there was anything like that down there. So you'll be interested maybe to know that Cook, when he goes as far south as he can go, he's at 70 degrees south, and he can't go any further. He's against the ice, and so he cannot go any further. So he makes a decision, and he announces to the crew that at noon we are going to jibe and head north. At which point, George Vancouver, our man, age 15, runs to the bowsprit and says, "I am the furthest man south of anyone in the world." So this is the guy we're dealing with. He also sailed with Cook on the third voyage, but not on Cook's second ship, Discovery. So he also was in Hawaii when Cook was killed. Well, in Vancouver's lifetime, the race was really on for domination and control of the entire Pacific coast, both North and South America. Now, the Spanish, of course, as we learned with Cabrillo, held sway in Latin and South America, as well as Mexico. But Alta California, our area in North, was vaguely up for grabs. Now, the Spanish felt, of course, this was their territory. And of course, the British, who are in Canada, see it as their territory. So, in fact, Spain and Britain nearly go to war over whose territory this is, Alta California, Northern California, and on up to Vancouver. Vancouver really becomes the spark, and that's what really the potential for war is. Well, there is finally a convention called, a little ahead of the story, but a convention called the Nootka Convention in 1790, which more or less settles the issue, at least it averts war. But George Vancouver was given the command of a vessel called Discovery, and he was ordered to go to this area in the Vancouver area with 2 ships. And he was to do some surveying of the coastline and essentially make certain that the flag of Great Britain was planted there firmly. So how do you get from England to the Pacific Northwest? Well, there's no Northwest Passage. By the way, he's supposed to find that too. So to get to California, of course, you have to come here, 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 and then all the way up. It's a long way around. No wonder they wanted the Northwest Passage. I mean, it's a long, long way around. So now it's November of 1792. And relations actually between George Vancouver and the Spanish commander, Quadra, actually are quite cordial. They trade maps, they get along, they have a drink together once in a while. They're surprisingly cordial. And of course, they're simply captains of ships. They're not in a position to make any agreement. By the way, communication with the Home Office takes 11 months each way. So you're not really sitting on your hands waiting for somebody to tell you what to do. So what Quadra and Vancouver do decide is that they will, how about if we name the island Vancouver Island, Quadra and Vancouver Island. So they name it that. But then as Spanish influence in the Northwest declines, they simply quietly drop the name Quadra and keep Vancouver. So a few shots of all of this. Remember, the charting is a big part of what Vancouver does, and a lot of these explorers do, and it's a major thing. And the way you do that is with longboats. You got to go inshore to measure the height of hills in the background, the depth of the water, where the rocks are, all this stuff, the amount of kelp, whether it's a rock bottom or a sand bottom, all this stuff has to be done, and Vancouver really does an excellent job. This is the area that they did a lot of charting in. And then they sail along south, and because as winter begins to set in, they go south. They actually, very intelligently, because Vancouver was there, remember, with Cook, they winter over where you and I would like to be, in Hawaii. And he gets along very well with Hawaiians. The whole Cook episode seems to have been passed over. So he returns to British Columbia and then on up to Alaska, and the Cook Inlet area. And he does a lot of exploring in and out of all these passages, desperately trying to find this bloody Northwest Passage. You think what it would be worth to have that, to know that. It would be like having a nuclear secret. But he does all this in and out. Remember, sailing into a passage with this kind of a rig and sailing out of that passage are two different, very different things. Not so easy. And so it's not easy. So he does this over and over, month after month, and finally says, listen, there is no possibility of a Northwest Passage. It's just not there. So after some, and here they are, you know, in these circumstances in Alaska, some beautiful conditions, and it's all magnificent, but it doesn't get him through. So he returns, sails back down the coast. Now they've got to go back to England, and so he leaves the Pacific Northwest in these beautiful territories, heads for Cape Horn, and then on back to England. So he has, over several years, completed a circumnavigation of the globe. Well, life at home back in England is not as it should have been. Considering all the work that he had done, the charting he had done, he was accused, I think quite unfairly, by a highly connected person of having been unkind, I guess is the word, to a crew member. Well, the crew member had been a rotten crew member, and Vancouver sent him home from Vancouver, from the island. But he was tried in the newspapers, and he was even beaten up in the street because people believed that he had been mean to this crew member. And his naval career ends, and the accusations fly fast and furious, and his naval career is over. And sadly, he dies in obscurity. He's buried in a quiet grave in Surrey, in England. So what of him, though? And why even talk tonight? Well, 25 years of very hard sailing. He developed excellent charts that others followed for not just decades, but for a century to come. Very dependable stuff. And you know, it made all the difference in the world to explorers who followed him, because they now knew how to get in, how to get out, what to look for. It's worth noting that he had, I think probably from his years with Cook, a strong feeling of welfare and protection for the indigenous people that he met. And I wanted to read you just a few of his words. He says, many of the fur traders, he's talking about the Pacific Northwest now, many of the fur traders have fomented discords and stirred up contentions between different tribes. They considered gain as their only object of pursuit. And whether this will be acquired by fair and honorable means or otherwise, the manner how it is obtained seems to have been a very secondary consideration. So he is kind of a hero in that sense that his concern for how native peoples are treated. And he got that from James Cook, who was really his model in the decades before, who had had clearly a profound influence on George Vancouver. Our next man is somebody that, if you've been to Australia, you may know the name, Matthew Flinders. He born in 1775. That would have been about the time Cook was in his second voyage. He's a figure of considerable seagoing fame. He's English. His father was a surgeon, and therefore he would be of some repute and therefore eligible to be an officer in the Royal Navy. I love this line. He, in his own words, he said, "I was induced to go to sea against the wishes of my friends, mainly from reading Robinson Crusoe." It's like reading Moby Dick and saying you want to be a whaler, you know, it's nuts. But in any case, he joins the Royal Navy at age 15. You think where you and I were at age 15, we wouldn't have been in the Royal Navy. So amongst others, he sailed with Captain Bligh on HMS Providence when they were transporting breadfruit from Tahiti to Jamaica. He also sailed as a midshipman on a ship called HMS Reliance. He does this sailing, it's a voyage to Australia. And he has learned navigation well, he's learned seamanship well, he's a good man. He's also, he's a young man, very young man, and he's sailing with a pal of his who is the ship's surgeon, a fellow named George Bass. And anybody who sailed Sydney Hobart has crossed the Bass Strait between the mainland of Australia and Tasmania. So the two of them are now in Australia. They are off duty, and they buy a little boat they call Tom Thumb, and they explore. You know, you just see these two young guys finding these places to go, and it's just a wonderful experience for them. But then he's called up by the Navy and given command of a small vessel, and they make him a lieutenant. And he is given, here's a picture of him, wonderful eyes. He is given an order to sail amongst the Furneaux Islands, which is between Australia and between the mainland of Australia and Tasmania. It's that strait right in here. So, right here. So, because if you could get through that area, and they didn't know that for sure, if you could get through that area, that would take days off the trip from England. You wouldn't have to go all the way around Tasmania then. You could go right through that strait and then up to Sydney. So that would cut days off. Well, he does that. He does the passage, goes all the way around Tasmania actually, and of course does it. And so he's been very successful. Well, meanwhile, back in England, our old friend Joseph Banks, remember, from Cook fame, says, listen, the Dutch aren't doing a darn thing with New Holland. We should take that. So he gets the Admiralty to employ our man here, Matthew Flinders, to chart the whole of the coast of Australia, to circumnavigate Australia. Now remember, the Dutch vaguely have it. They call it New Holland, but they're not doing anything with it, and they don't seem very interested in it. And they haven't done anything with it for a long time. So he is given the command of this vessel called the Investigator. Well, it's a pretty good sized ship, not in very good shape. She's 300 tons, which gives you some idea, about 120 feet. And so he sails from England down. By the way, he was newly married, and contrary to Admiralty rules, he smuggles his wife aboard. And but then they stop someplace, Madeira, I think. She's found out, and so she is sent back, and he is admonished but allowed to continue. And those two do not see each other for another 9 years. So life is not that easy. But they sail south, and they get around the Cape of Storms, and this is what they know. This is what people know as New Holland. This is, of course, Western Australia, but they don't know anything here, really. So his goal is to sail all the way around and have some feel for the whole thing. Oops, let's see, go here. So, now, he sails south, goes past Cape Horn, across the Indian Ocean, and then to Nieuw-Holland and New Holland, and they began then the business of charting, and the trip all the way around New Zealand, all the way around Australia rather, to do the accurate charting of the whole place. So, this is from a map that Cook made, because Cook had done part of New South Wales, that is to say part of the east coast of Australia. So he does this, and he goes up around the top of Australia, through the Gulf of Carpentaria, and you can see he's quite thorough. He goes all the way into the Gulf, all the way along the edges, and all the way around. So it's a big operation. And there's a Google map which gives you a good feeling for how big it really is. So this would be typical of the coastline that he would be charting. So not so easy to chart these things. I mean, you gotta stall offshore, or you have to get inshore in small boats to figure this stuff out. And to be able to describe it accurately, and then to be able to get it down in print. So these are all critical views of things. So, having completed this monumental task that the Admiralty had assigned him, he does it. He gets all the way around Australia, all the way back to Sydney again. Then he is assigned to be a passenger on a ship called HMS Porpoise. Well, Porpoise is on his way back to England, leaves Sydney, goes aground, and is wrecked on what now is known as Wreck Reef. Is wrecked. And Matthew Flinders gets in a dinghy in a launch with 4 other guys, rows 700 miles, rows and sails 700 miles back to Sydney, gets a crew, goes back and rescues everybody. So he's a pretty heroic character. Now, his trials are not done. So he's now given a sloop, a small schooner to sail back to England. And so he is on his way back, and it's got quite a few problems. And so he stops at Mauritius, which is French. And the French are now at war with the British, which Flinders doesn't know, are now at war with the British. And so they imprison Flinders for 5 years. So it's not an easy life for him. So there is this wonderful marker, Southern Ocean, Indian Ocean, down there with his name on it. So he finally does make it home to England in failing health, and really, for the first time, makes reference in his writings to this land that he has circumnavigated. It has always been known as Terra Australis, Terra Incognita, different things. He refers to it finally as simply Australia. And that really is the first time that word is used. So he's the first guy to do that. Like George Vancouver, he dies early, age 40. But he's been a great sailor, really a wonderful cartographer, map maker, and many other things are named for Flinders. He's been a great explorer. There's a mountain range named for him. There's a very large island in the middle of the Bass Strait, one of the stormiest places in the world. He's actually a figure down under who is fairly famous. So our last one is Richard Henry Dana. You almost have to say all three words, don't you? It doesn't work with just Richard Dana. Born 1815. Here's a guy I think all of us would like to have known. He's from a New England family. Family that actually could trace its roots right back to the Mayflower. He grew up in Cambridge. Went to a private school, actually, that was overseen by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And later he's a student at Harvard College, where I'm almost pleased at this, where as a student he was involved in a protest and got thrown out for 6 months. But in his junior year at Harvard, he acquires the measles. And in those days, it was very, very dangerous. And he was losing his eyesight. And so, which is really what inspired him to take this voyage to the Pacific coast of North America. So unlike his counterparts who headed to Europe, who could afford to go to Europe for those grand tours, his parents could not afford to do that. So Dana, in an attempt on his own to change his lifestyle, to help perhaps improve his vision, he enlists as a merchant seaman. And in 1834, he sets sail on the brig Pilgrim, which was bound for Alta, California. So remember, the year is 1834, so we're a long way from us being a state. It's still, at least for the time being, part of Mexico, though no longer Spanish. Well, let me read you, if I may, a few lines from 2 Years Before the Mast. And if you don't remember much about this book, you should read it again. He writes with wonderful self-deprecating humor and wonderful descriptions. He writes beautifully. This is the first paragraph. Departure. I made my appearance on board at 12 o'clock in full sea rig, and I supposed that I should pass very well for Jack Tar. But it is impossible to deceive the practiced eye in these matters, and while I supposed myself to be looking as salt as Neptune himself, I was no doubt known for a landsman by everybody on board as soon as I hove into sight. So he doesn't kid himself. He doesn't know anything about sailing. And he's doing this because he's trying to get away from his books and that existence and trying to recover his eyesight. Let me read you a few lines of his from his log. Sunday, November the 10th. We are nearing Cape Horn. Monday, November 11th. During a part of this day, we were hove to, but the rest of the time we were driving on, close under reefed sails with heavy seas, a strong gale, and frequent squalls of hail and snow. Tuesday, the 12th, the same. Wednesday, the same. Thursday, the same. And then he talks about laying out on the yards. And I love this. He says, laying out on the yard, holding on with all my strength, not feeling of much use to anyone, and being sick several times while up there on the yard. And of course, being down below isn't any better. I mean, you're the smell of the bilge and all the muck and everything's wet and cold. And still, I mean, it's pretty tough life. Still, what an adventure for a young man. And he is young. So the voyage via Cape Horn is as tough as it's ever been. And it's known as the Crouching Lion, and does rather have that appearance, doesn't it? And then he sails up the coast of South America and then along our coast, as some of us will remember our own gray-brown hills from a few years ago, particularly without Newport Coast and all the rest. Allowing him to visit a variety of places, including San Diego, San Juan Capistrano, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, Monterey. The real purpose of Pilgrim's Voyage, which I probably didn't mention, was to get hides from ranchers in Alta California and then have them dried and put aboard the ship and brought back to Boston. So remember, the Transcontinental Railway is the thing of the future. So the voyage took him in our vicinity to missions, particularly San Juan Capistrano, and the bluffs at Dana Point made it difficult because to get the hides down to the ship with the bluffs being so steep was difficult, but the hides were, they were hard hides, so they throw them like frisbees down the cliff. And sometimes they would get stuck halfway down, and at one point Dana describes how he's lowered by ropes trying to recover those bad frisbee throws. And so, there's a certain amount of fun in all of this for all the trauma that goes with it. So they do spend a lot of time in these places because sometimes the hides had not been yet cured, so it took them some time. Then, if they weren't cured, they had to be cured before they were taken aboard the ship. So he spends some time, particularly in San Diego, which he says, these are his words, for loading and taking on hides, San Diego is decidedly the best place in California. So, but after nearly a year of this voyaging, a couple more shots of that area, and you can see how difficult it would be to get things down that cliff. After nearly a year of this voyaging, his eyesight has returned, and he is looking forward to going back to school. So he asks the captain if he can essentially jump ship, and the captain agrees. And there's another ship going back to Boston earlier than they're going to go, called the Alert, and so he is able to join the Alert and come back down the coast and on his way back to Boston. His voyage back to Boston, by the way, via Cape Horn, it's an Antarctic winter down there, and so the passage to Cape Horn was even more traumatic than the trip out from Cape Horn. Herman Melville, in his book, White Jacket, writes, if you want the best idea of Cape Horn, get my friend Dana's unmatchable 2 years before the mast. It must have been written with an icicle. Well, he arrives in Boston in September of 1836. And fortunately, he kept a diary of really all those 2 remarkable years. But some things you may not know about Dana. He re-enrolls at Harvard, and he graduates from law school there. Among other things, he takes up the cause of seamen. He's seen some pretty unpleasant scenes, even aboard Pilgrim, of guys getting flogged, and senselessly flogged. And he sees seamen as having no support in court, no one to help him. And his first publication is actually a book, a small book called The Seaman's Friend, which details the rights of seamen. And it's a very important first document protecting seamen. His second publication was, of course, 2 years before the mast. And if you don't know, 2 years before that, meaning if you were before the mast, that meant that you were a crewman member. If you were after the mast, then you were an officer. So this is 2 years before the mast. You may not know, too, that Dana became an avid abolitionist. Remember, this is just before the Civil War. And he's the founder, one of the founders of the Free Soil Party. He also publishes a book, To Cuba and Back, which is still available, in 1859, when the United States was thinking about considering annexing Cuba from Spain. He argues cases in front of the Supreme Court. He's no small-time lawyer. He argues cases in front of the Supreme Court. He's actually a counsel on the trial of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. He's a member of the Massachusetts State Legislature. He's not just a sailor who wrote this book. The book, 2 years before the mast, fits in a way rather oddly into the life of Dana, who actually hardly ever wrote again. He regarded the book as something of an accident. In fact, he regarded that time in his life as simply a young man's adventure. And really, he wanted to talk about his more serious callings, public service and being a serious lawyer. He did a fair amount of traveling afterwards. He went to England, he went to the Far East, he was in Hawaii, he was in California again. But mostly, he practiced law in Boston. He had hoped to enter Congress, but he really had no stomach, and who would, for campaigning. So he doesn't. At one point, he's nominated to be the United States ambassador to Great Britain, but it gets stalled in the Senate. Some things never change, and it doesn't happen. So to do research on a book on international law, he moves with his family to Rome. And it's one of those terrible times when the influenza plague goes through Europe and he dies within a year of pneumonia. He's buried there. There's the cover of the book. This is his son, Robert the third, because remember, Dana was junior, so this is the third. He married Edith Longfellow, the daughter of, you guessed it, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So, let me just conclude by saying that reflecting upon his own great adventure with Pilgrim in his youth, he understood finally that he would be remembered not for his work in law, but rather for this book. He said, that time, and this is his quote, that time aboard Pilgrim was but a parenthesis in my life. But I think we would say, wow, what a parenthesis. I mean, holy smokes. So he concludes, I'm going to end this evening with a line, which is the last few lines of 2 years before the mast, which he says, "And I will take the liberty on parting with my reader, who has gone down with us to the oceans, to commend that class of men with whom, for a time, my lot was cast. Whatever favor this book may find, I shall owe almost entirely to that interest in the sea and those who follow it, which is so easily excited in us all." So that is Richard Henry Dana, and any more stories have to wait for another night.
I want to thank David again for participating in Seafaring Tales and really for a great 3 lectures. I know I certainly learned a lot. It was fabulous. Makes me want to go back to history class. We hope that you will join us for our next lecture. It's Don Walsh. It's October 4th. If you have an RSVP when you leave, you can just give your name at the desk and let us know. We have a 4 o'clock and a 7 o'clock time. And again, we really appreciate your support. Thank you for being members of the museum. It's your support that makes these possible. So again, thank you. Drive safely. Have a great night. And again, thanks to David Graham.